Hey, this is Ian again. So I'm going to be doing chapter 1 of the Reluctant Regent today. So I'm going to have it up on my screen. And I was thinking actually about the commentary, and I think I'm going to save most of that for the end, at the end of the chapter, just to help with the continuity of it. So in this chapter, as I noted in the description, this is where we meet a couple of the main characters, and we kind of set the tone for this story. So let me go ahead and share my screen here and I will get into it. Okay, so Reluctant Regent, Revised Editions, Chapter 1, Brawling with Strangers. This is a really, really bad idea, I thought, as I adjusted my shield while simultaneously trying to avoid jabbing myself with my blunted spear. Maybe the worst I've ever had. Tourney Field was hard-packed dirt, baked dry in the afternoon sun. The hazy light glinted ominously from the dulled weapons of the mob of jeering, unsavory-looking types across the field for me, whom I would supposedly be charging in a few short moments. The crowd of onlookers was, it seemed, largely drunk and roaring out sage advice like, "Hit him with the spiky end and attack, attack," as if I might be under the mistaken impression that we were here to engage in, I don't know, dramatic poetry reading or something. The rest of their suggestions were a mixture of things that were probably physically impossible, definitely ethically unsound, and downright impolite in civilized society. It was hot. The air was breathlessly still, and my sweat-soaked gambeson felt like it weighed 30 stone. Now, gambeson is a type of armor. It's usually kind of a heavy felt or something like that. Hell, you can Google it. You figure it out. In short, it was nothing like a heroic ballad, and I, being an average-looking, bookish sort of fellow with unkempt brown hair and clear green eyes, definitely didn't exhibit any heroic qualities. If anything, I looked like a vaguely confused scholar who'd gotten lost on his way to the library, and who had somehow mistakenly wandered into the middle of an impending battle. That was actually a fairly accurate description of the current state of affairs. Now, when I was choosing the melee at the Royal Annual Tourney, it hadn't seemed like a bad idea when I made that decision. But then I suppose bad ideas never seem as such when you're making them. As the eldest heir of a formerly great house, I was strongly encouraged to take part in this Royal Annual Tourney to fulfill some sort of archaic, illogical coming-of-age obligation to my house. Although it was never exactly clear to me what my participation in this grand tourney was supposed to accomplish, other than allowing the common folk to see me get knocked off my horse. And maybe that's the only reason the king needed, I don't know. At any rate, it was clearly a tradition now, and as such, asking why was frowned upon by everyone involved. So when my stepfather, a loud man named Regent, began insisting that my dear departed mum would want me to participate, all while trying not to look too eager at the prospect of me taking a mace to the face, I realized that regardless of the dubious benefits of this exercise, I had to take part, if only to shut him up. So I decided on the melee. My thinking at the time was rather than, say, joining the joust, where there was no one to hide behind, in the melee I could blend in with my teammates, wave my spear around enthusiastically for a few minutes, then fall off my horse in a suitably dramatic fashion. And this way I could simultaneously fulfill my obligations to my house while safely disqualifying myself from actually fighting and or getting brained by an overly motivated member of the other team. Brilliant, right? But unfortunately, I hadn't factored in my horse. Seeing as my unpleasant equine companion played such an important role in all the troubles that soon followed, I think it's appropriate to spend a few moments describing my first encounter with him. So after Vergia's ultimatum, I went to the stables to find a suitable mount. I needed something ill-tempered, bitey, and warlike. I found our ancient doddering groomsman napping outside the barn and asked him if A, he happened to own a war horse, and B, if so, could I, as the scion of our house, perhaps borrow it to participate in the Royal Annual Tourney melee the following day. The old man nodded sleepily and vaguely pointed to the stall at the far end of the building. Then, his pay clearly earned for the day, he fell back asleep. Muttering to myself about the quality of the help, I walked to the stall and peered inside. The weakly flickering torch set a few feet away provided a feeble light, so I had to take a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dimness. Now, the first thing I noticed was the smell. The entire stall reeked of a combination of horsey bodily fluids and old dusty hay, with just a pitch of brimstone thrown in for good measure. Next, I noticed the source of said smell, and what a source it was. Standing in the stall was what could charitably be called the ugliest horse I had ever seen. It was stocky, more like an over-muscled pony than a proper war horse. His coat was a dull reddish brown, patchy, coarse as rusty wire. His mane and tail were stringy, lightly tinted an odd shade of bile green. But what really struck me were his eyes. They were a goat's eyes, not horses, and they gleamed an unsettling orangish red in the shadowy light. I stared at this abomination, and he stared expressionlessly back at me. Uncanny predatory intelligence in his lambent gaze. The shadow he cast in the flickering torchlight seemed like a normal horse's silhouette, but when I turned my head slightly, it became something monstrous. Dog-like creature with jagged fangs and twisted barbed horns. So, yeah, all in all, there was something subtly wrong and yet strangely compelling about him. The horse looked at me with an evil glint in his eyes, then winked. Yeah, but no, I thought, and promptly turned around and returned to the peacefully slumbering stable hand. Sir, sir, I shouted, roughly shaking him. The violence is inherent in the system, he shouted as he started awake. When he saw me, he looked vaguely alarmed and said, Oh, monsieur, what do you want, young masser? What's wrong with that horse? I asked. It looks like it's either insane, diseased, or possessed. Maybe even a combination of all three. Nothing wrong with him, young masser, he said, giving me a largely toothless smile. He's a fighter is all. Not bred for looks, you know. He's fierce. Well, where did you buy him? Can't we talk to them about, I don't know, getting our money back? I don't like the looks of him. Seems like trouble. Didn't buy him, young master, the stableman said proudly. I found him wandering outside after that nasty storm we had last month. None comes looking for him, so he's ours now, eh? Wait, you found this thing wandering around after a massive thunderstorm and decided to what? Just appropriate it without wondering where it came from? And this seemed like a good idea to you? Aye, he said. At least this ways we've got a proper warhouse for the house. Hate right for an old house like this to gnaw having. Hate right. Okay, I said with a heavy sigh. Guess if this is the only war horse we've got, this is the one I'll use tomorrow. What's his name? Moose, I calls him, he said, on account of his looking like him. And you don't even have to saddle him. You don't like the bridle, so you just sit on him and let him get to it. And he does like getting to it. He does at that. He chuckled to himself and settled back on his stool and was soon snoring again. So I resignedly walked back to the stall and looked at my new steed. I didn't know what a moose looked like exactly, but I was pretty sure it wasn't this. Well, I guess you're it, Moose, I said with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. You're my prancing steed. Moose looked at me expressionlessly, his horsey face a mask of concealed intentions. Would you like to go for a ride? I asked, increasingly nervous at his blank stare. Or an apple? Or something? Silence. Then he chewed his cud. Once. Are we going to be friends? You're not going to bite me, are you? No response, although I noticed an alarming increase in his cud chewing, as if he was eagerly anticipating a near future when he would indeed be biting me. I stuttered. The only reason I ask is that I need a horse to ride, in the melee tomorrow, and I'd rather not get kicked in the face or gnawed on before that happens. Moose's ears perked up, an excited gleam in his eyes. He walked slowly over to the stall gate and sniffed me once. Then he looked me full in the eyes and bared his oddly pointed teeth in a creepy, horsey grin. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen at that point in my life, and I'll admit, I came fairly close to soiling myself when I saw it. Then he nudged open the somehow unlatched stall door and deliberately walked into the aisle. Moose was ready to enter the world and had clearly chosen me as his rider. The divines help us all. And that was how I met Moose. Despite this inauspicious start, we've been, well, I wouldn't call us friends so much as loosely affiliated acquaintances ever since. The rest of the day before the tourney was a whirlwind of activity. I found a blunted spear, a leather gambeson, and a battered shield on which I painted the winged minotaur sigil of our house. Practicing my rusty equestrian skills on a newly enthusiastic Moose took up the rest of the day. And it went well. Suspiciously so in retrospect, but Moose was easy to ride and seemed to anticipate all of my commands with a sixth sense that bordered on the supernatural. And it probably was, now that I think about it. But all in all, I had every reason to think that my plan was going to come off with a minimum of trouble, and I fell into bed that evening and slept as soundly as only fools and the hopelessly drunk can. And now I found myself astride a hideously ugly horse, looking with increasing alarm at a large group of armed thugs who were shortly going to be thundering towards me in a, hopefully, vain attempt to knock my teeth in. And I liked my teeth right where they were, thank you very much. Moose, however, seemed delighted by the prospect, which did little to calm me, and he pranced about eagerly, snorting with impatience as we waited to begin. I was so engrossed in my thoughts and in trying not to fall off my horse that I didn't hear the man beside me addressing me until he shouted in my ear, "Oi, mate, you with the winged cow on your shield." "It's not a cow, it's a minotaur," I muttered. Then I looked over at him. He was a stocky man dressed in mail, wielding a nasty-looking scimitar. "Yes, can I help you, noble comrade in arms?" "What's wrong with your horse?" he asked, snickering. "Has he got disease, mange, or something? He looks sick. And why is he so twitchy?" "He's fine," I answered, giving Moose a tentative pat on the neck. "He's just excited is all. And he doesn't have mange, he's just having a bad pelt day. Right, boy?" Moose gave me an irritated look and snorted, pawing the ground with frustrated bloodlust. "Hey, whatever you say, young sir," my erstwhile comrade laughed, peering down at me from his beautiful black war steed. It looked like it had been bred over generations to carry noble warriors to and from glorious battles. And it had probably cost more than my entire house's holdings put together. I also noticed, however, that it kept a wary distance from Moose. "We're so lucky to have a winged cowman riding a diseased nag on our side. How could we possibly lose?" With raucous laughter, he returned to his friends and took up the usual preliminary shouting and weapon brandishing that seemed traditional at events like this. Moose snorted irritably, pawing the dusty hardpan again and eyeballing the largest opponent on the other team, who just happened to be a mountain of a man with a full-faced horned helm, holding a silk-wrapped two-handed broadsword that was as long as he was. He was wearing what looked like a skirt, but was probably the kilt that the Lowlander clanfolk wore before shedding the blood of their foolish enemies. He was so large, in fact, that he wasn't even riding a horse, and instead he just stood silently at the center of the opposing line, idly digging the tip of his broadsword into the hard ground. Now, Lowlanders were a notoriously ill-tempered bunch, so I made a mental note to keep as far away from him as possible during the upcoming festivities. After what seemed an interminable amount of time, a short, plump woman dressed in violently greenish-colored robes trotted to the center of the field and began shrilly informing us of the rules for the upcoming melee. I couldn't hear much, as the weapon brandishing and insults continued unabated on both sides, but the gist of it was that we should try to maim, but not kill our opponents, although, accidents were known to happen, and that the last warrior standing would apparently win a fabulous prize. Then, with her duties done, she trotted right back off the field, and before I could even raise my hand to ask what she'd meant by accidents when no to happen, a horn blew, and with a slowly building rumble of iron-shod hooves and jingling harnesses, we were off. Not the big guy, not the big guy, I screamed as Moose galloped madly towards the large sword-wielding Lowlander, who was slowly plodding forward onto the field, clearly as unenthused as I about this entire exercise. Also, he was so encased in heavy plate armor that I was surprised he could even move. But my independent-minded horse would have none of it, and soon I found myself in alarming proximity to the largest warrior on the field, one who was laying about himself with increasing fervor as the two sides collided with a shock of flesh and metal, and the fighting began in earnest. Moose planted his hooves and slid to a halt in a shower of dirt, dodging the sweep of the massive sword and almost dumping me in the process. Then he charged forward and smashed into the lowland warrior, knocking the big man off of his feet. But unfortunately, this only proved to be a minor inconvenience because he leapt right back up, punched a random charging warrior in the face with one hand, and slung his broadsword into my side with the other. The blunted blade thudded into my shield with such force that it numbed my entire arm. And, oh yeah, it knocked me clean off my eager mount. Hit the ground with a whoosh, my spear spinning away into the increasingly dust-clouded melee. And my helmet slipped over my eyes because, who needs to see during moments like this, right? I gasped a lungful of dirty air and promptly began coughing and wheezing for breath as I staggered to my feet, shoved my helmet back, and I frantically looked around for my spear, horse, and or the large man mountain who was probably en route to brain and or maim me. I could see none of them, only the shadowy shouting figures flailing at each other in the haze of dust. Moose had apparently, and wisely, decided to vacate the premises, so it looked like I was on my own. Suddenly I felt a heavy tap on my shoulder. "I'm right behind you, little man," said a deep, melancholy voice. "Yeah!" I shrieked, but, in a manly way, as I whirled around and saw the Lowlander looming over me, his broadsword casually draped over his shoulder. "Don't do that," I yelled, backpedaling and desperately looking around for something to throw at him. "Sorry," he said, distractedly backhanding some fool that came barreling out of the dust. He looked down at me thoughtfully for a moment, then announced, "I'm going to break you now, little cow man." "It's not a cow, for Damon's sake. It's clearly a minotaur. Holy hell, why does nobody get that?" I finally gave up on trying to find something to assault him with and adjusted my shield, determined to hold out until someone else managed to join our little party and provide a distraction so I could escape. Now, as an aside, you may remember me that my initial plan was to fall off my horse at the earliest opportunity, which I'd kind of done, and thereby avoiding the very situation in which I now found myself. But what can I say? Cow comments really got to me. "More people know what a cow looks like than a minotaur," he said reasonably as he hoisted his sword off of his shoulder and began idly stretching his arms. "So they're going to default to that when they look at it." He considered for a moment. "You probably should have gone with a mythical beast that looked less like a farm animal. Maybe I don't know, hydra or three-headed demon dog, something like that." "Well, it's our house coat of arms, and I painted it myself. It's clearly a minotaur based on the style of the Eurytic artist of the first Sarmacian emperors," I huffed. "I saw a picture of it in the Encyclopedia Ancientica Irrelevantia, volume 19. So I know it's accurate. So surely I can't be blamed if the uneducated can't figure out the difference between a minotaur and a cow." "What is the difference?" he asked, sounding vaguely interested as he slowly circled around me. "Well, for one, a cow is quadrupedal," I responded, warily keeping my shield between us. Where was everyone? Was I not supposed to be part of a team here? Why then was I facing Man Mountain alone? I continued. A minotaur isn't quadrupedal, so if you see something that looks like a cow, but it's walking on two legs, that's a good sign you're looking at a minotaur and not, say Daisy, the neighboring yokel's dairy cow. Also, no udders on a minotaur, I added, on account of them being an entirely different species and all. All this information is easily available if you want to find it, so there's no excuse for confusing the sigil of my house for some sort of malformed farm animal. Huh, he said, clearly unimpressed. And then the question of what exactly was on my shield became irrelevant as he delivered a massive overhand blow, shattering my carefully painted work of art into multiple pieces. The impact knocked me to my knees, and my ill-fitting helmet slid over my eyes. Again, I swear the damn thing was trying to get me killed. I lurched up and jumped sideways, desperately trying to avoid whatever nastiness he was undoubtedly sending my way. What are you doing, little cowman? The Lowlander said, an amused note in his deep voice. I tore my helm off, since all it was doing was blinding me, and looked up. He was standing a few feet away, sword tip finger span from my chest. Dodging! I shouted, noting that he held the massive steel broadsword effortlessly, sort of as if he was wielding a twig rather than something designed to efficiently send fools like me into the afterlife. I'm dodging you! Good job. You have evaded my attack, he solemnly said, and added politely. You're actually doing very well for somebody who is obviously unskilled, naturally high-strung, and clumsy. Now, you should probably lie down and pretend I walloped you so that I don't actually have to hurt you. Never, I shouted in an ill-advised bout of bravado, waving my puny fists at him. The bearers of the winged minotaur never surrender. Okay, then, little cowman, the Lowlander said with a shrug, and raised his sword to finish me off. Have it your way. Just then, another shrieking, sword-waving fool staggered out of the dusty haze and aimed a mighty blow at the Lowlander's head. He easily ducked under the swing and slammed his head into the other warrior's face, which then exploded in a fountain of blood and teeth. The unfortunate man staggered back, and with a baby-like mew, sank to his knees, dropping his sword into the swirling dust. Lie down, the Lowlander said sternly, looking down at his erstwhile opponent. I don't wish to knock the remaining teeth out of your head, because that will drastically reduce the chances of you ever finding a mate. Please consider your options carefully before your next move. I am not a heartless man, but I will end you, if that's what you wish. Grr, the man gurgled. Then, after giving his options careful consideration, he promptly lay down in the fetal position. And while this exercise in amateur dentistry and reproductive advice was going on, I was still frantically looking around for something, anything, to bash this Lowlander with. In a twist of blind luck, I stumbled over a semi-conscious warrior with a sizable dent in her helmet lying on the ground behind me. I noticed she had a wickedly spiked mace in her hand. Do you mind if I borrow this? I asked politely as I tugged it loose. Weird, she mumbled, her unfocused eyes staring past me. Now, obviously, battle doesn't lend itself to clear communication, which is something I've noticed time and again over the years. Is that weird as in you mind, or weird as in go ahead? I asked. She just looked up at me blearily. So after an awkward pause, I decided having a mason in a situation like this far outweighed any tricky questions of property rights that might arise later. Okay, then, I'll bring it right back, I said cheerily as I hefted it and turned to see what my mountainous friend was up to. As it turns out, he was just finishing his dental advice to his latest victim, so I took the opportunity to sneak up and deliver a mighty blow to the side of his head. The force of my strike snapped the Lowlander's chin strap, and it twisted his helm sideways until its eye slips were jammed roughly around his ear. Well struck, little cow, he said, his voice echoing eerily. Well struck indeed. He dropped his two-hander and began tugging on his helm to try to twist it back into position. Ha ha! I shouted. Now I've got you. and I brandished my mace at him. Or I tried to. What I ended up brandishing was a splintered wooden stump. Apparently, the poorly constructed thing had been damaged before I picked it up, and the force of my blow had broken it completely. Now, once again, I was reduced to harsh language and attitude to defend myself. Problems? The Lowlander asked politely as he continued tugging on his helmet. My silence and lack of a follow-up blow obviously indicated to him that things weren't going to plan. No, no, everything is fine, I said with false bravado as I dropped the stump and began trying to scavenge something up to clobber him with. Now you'd think with a battle raging around us, there'd be all kinds of implements of destruction just lying around and ready for use. But unfortunately, I couldn't see anything nearby except for dust and the dust-obscured figures of the newly unconscious. All of their weapons had apparently vanished into the haze. But just when things looked bleakest, my eyes happened upon the broadsword lying in the hardpan at his feet. Well, I suppose I could work, I muttered, assuming I could even lift the damn thing. So, after carefully edging around the Lowlander, I grabbed the blade and attempted to hoist it onto my shoulder. It was a beautiful sword, as Lowlander weapons tended to be, with a rippled dark steel blade carefully wrapped in black silk to blunt the edge, an ebony hilt engraved with runes of power, and a silver wire-wrapped grip. It was also almost taller than I was and weighed about as much as a full-grown, well-fed man. With a groan, I staggered to get it up onto my shoulder. Then I staggered again to get around behind him. Once I got there, I stopped for a moment, panting as I tried to catch my breath. The Lowlander stopped tugging on his helm for a moment and asked suspiciously, "What are you doing out there?" "Nothing, nothing," I gasped. "Just trying to, plan my next move. One can never be too strategic in situations like this, after all." "That's true," he mused, his voice echoing hollowly. "So often we get caught up in the heat of the moment and don't consider the long-term consequences of our actions. It's very disheartening." He sighed. Quite right," I grunted as I hefted his broadsword and prepared myself to not consider the long-term consequences of my actions. "Are you sure you're not up to something?" he asked again. "I feel like you're up to no good." "No, nothing for you to worry about yourself, kind sir," I said. "You've obviously got enough on your mind right now without me adding to it." "That's the damn truth," he muttered, and then went back to vainly trying to twist his great helm around. I knew I should have changed my chin strap before the melee started. I looked thoughtfully at him for a moment, then asked, "So I've got a crazy hypothetical question for you. If somebody wanted to, say, knock somebody else out, but didn't want to, severely injure them, where would you strike?" Lowlander stopped tugging and pondered for a minute. "Well, I think it would depend on what you're trying to smack them with, but with something like, say, a broadsword, you'd want to strike with the flat of the blade and aim at the side of their head, right here," said as he thumped his finger helpfully on a spot right over his left temple. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason. I just always wondered about that." "Thanks," I replied. Then, with a grunt, I hoisted the broadsword off my shoulder and carefully aimed at the behemoth's armored head. Suddenly he froze, knelt, began blindly groping around his feet. "Hey, where's my sword? Where's reasoned response? Do you see it anywhere? Oh man, it's a family heirloom. I can't lose it or I'll be in a lot of trouble." "Reasoned response?" I asked incredulously as I adjusted my grip. "Your family's blade is named Reasoned Response? How can a sword be a reasoned response to anything?" "You don't know Lowlanders," he said in a melancholy voice. "Most of our disagreements and feuds are so irrational that a broadsword is the best way to de-escalate them. Now, are you going to help me find it or not?" "I see it," I said in a strained voice. "Hold still and I'll get it for you." He stopped his frantic fumbling with a sigh of relief And at that moment, I delivered a tremendous strike to the side of his head with the flat of the blade. His helm rang like a gong, and the broadsword shivered in my hands. Lucky I didn't drop it. At that exact moment, I heard a high-pitched neighing behind me, and a gust of wind blew the dust that had obscured most of the melee away. And just as it cleared, the Lowlander slowly toppled forward onto his face and hit the hard-packed ground with a loud clang. With a sigh of relief, I lowered reasoned response, then leaned on it in an effort to catch my breath. And I looked blearily around the field, seeing only feebly twitching, groaning mounds of bodies lying strewn about where they'd fallen. Here and there, a dejected-looking mount wandered, sniffing for their semi-conscious rider, except for one hideously ugly horse, which was standing right behind me, with a fiendish grin on its face. "Moose," I explained. "There you are. Where in the hells did you go? You left me alone to fight him." I gestured at the motionless Lowlander. And Lowlanders are not people you want to fight one-on-one, especially ones with swords like this. It's as big as I am, for the divine's sake. Moose snorted dismissively and looked away, clearly bored with the conversation. He pawed at the ground, then wandered off, heading towards a patch of grass on the far edge of the field. As I furiously glared after him, I suddenly noticed a strange roaring sound and looked up to see the drunken mob surrounding the tourney field cheering wildly for some reason. And then I had beheld the surreal sight of the violently green-robed lady gingerly picking her way across the body-strewn battlefield towards me. Her arrival was preceded by an invisible cloud of something that smelled of lilacs and spoiled wine. She fastidiously dabbed her face with an embroidered silk handkerchief that she was holding in one plump hand. And then she glanced around in disapproval. "Well," she said primly, "isn't this a mess? And to think that one such as yourself would emerge as the winner in such an untidy event." "I'm the who now?" I said, blinking stupidly at her. "You're the winner, silly. Now up, up, raise your arms. There you go. Yes, keep holding that broadsword. What a fine weapon it is, surely a relic of your house. And who are you again?" "Oh, Matthias of House Caldor? Of course, of course. I should have recognized the winged cow on what's left of your shield." "Oh, you don't say. That's a minotaur? I'm so sorry. A minotaur it so clearly is. Did you know that minotaurs are actually quite peaceful unless disturbed?" "Yes, I know. They have a reputation for goring people, but I have no sympathy at all for someone who barges in on one, shouting and trying to stab it. No sympathy at all. Got what they deserved, I say." I numbly followed her as she led me to the royal box where everybody that was anyone in the kingdom was seated. And what a collection of personages it was. There was the king, of course, pudgy, bald, bored, idly waving a sloshing goblet as he expounded on something. There was his daughter, the High Princess Diranus, blonde, dressed in green silk and petting a magnificent golden-eyed cat. And there was a loud, colorfully dressed assemblage of hangers-on, advisors, and others whose role was less apparent. They resembled nothing more than a collection of bleeding, arm-waving, flightless birds as they competed for the king's attention. The only person who seemed even vaguely aware of what was going on was Cyrene, the notoriously competent court advisor standing quietly behind the royal family. She was reading a parchment, occasionally glancing around in irritation when one or another of the courtiers around her made a particularly loud or ignorant comment, often simultaneously. As I bemusedly looked at this gaggle of posturing personages, I realized something. The louder a person speaks, the less likely it is that whatever they're shouting is worthwhile. It's almost as if the loud, hand-waving types are using volume to compensate for not having much to say. As I thought that, I studied Cyrene as virulent green, and I patiently stood in front of the chattering crowd, waiting for the king to complete his thought and notice us. Now, I had heard about Cyrene, how it was rumored that she actually ran the kingdom so the king could expound on whatever he was currently expounding on, and his daughter could devote her time to her cats. And at first I found it hard to believe. She was just a small, slender woman with pale brown hair tied back in a severe bun, with a fine boned, almost elfin face that was attractive in an understated sort of way. She was dressed in a simple black dress and had a satchel at her feet stuffed to bursting with papers, pens, a few books, and what looked like a Siberian murder dirk, which is the primary negotiating tool of those infamous South Sea corsairs. Then she glanced up from the paper that she was studying and saw me. Her eyes were a pale blue and shone with a sharp intelligence that rocked me back on my heels. And I still remember that first look. Me standing in front of the royal box, sweaty, covered in dust, and dragging an absurdly long broadsword, and her standing behind the king with a document in her hand and a slightly quizzical look on her face. Oh, it's romance. Just kidding. We'll go back to it. Then she gave her head a quick shake, leaned over, and whispered something in the king's ear. He abruptly stopped talking and looked down at me, trying to focus his piggy eyes. Ah, and who might you be? He slurred. This, said Virulent Green proudly, is Sir Matthias of House Caldor, the winner of the melee. She flapped her hand impatiently at me, by which I assumed she meant I was to step forward and bow. So I did. The king looked down at me for a moment and then said, Right. So what are you up to then? Cyrene's lips compressed slightly and she leaned forward and urgently whispered to him again, this time emphasizing her point with a few sharp pokes in my direction. Okay, I understand, the king muttered. No need to start lecturing me again. He cleared his throat loudly. As the winner of the melee and thereby exhibiting bravery and skill in the face of certain death and or maiming, I hereby grant you 3 requests. Please note that these requests do not include my dear daughter's hand in marriage. Princess didn't even look up at this. Or a sum of gold sufficient to cause financial hardship to the kingdom. Requesting anything along those lines is considered treason and will result in your untimely and messy death. Is this understood? I started, yes, I think so. Excellent, he exclaimed, beaming down at me like I was his favorite, if somewhat slow pet. Now, what would you like? Well, I said, rubbing my head and desperately trying to think of something that wasn't the equivalent of a princess, or what amount of gold would cause undue financial distress to the kingdom. And this was made harder because I had no idea what state our finances were. Let me see here. I glanced down at the broadsword still clenched in my hand, then realized with dawning horror that I was dragging the family heirloom of a Lowlander clan around in the dust like it was some sort of cheap gardening tool. Now, I didn't know how they'd react to that, but seeing all the time and effort it took to overcome just one of them without becoming a hilarious historical footnote, I had no desire to find out. So, the first thing I needed to do was take care of this little catastrophe. Well, I suppose the first thing I'd like to ask is that this fine blade be returned to the nice gentleman I accidentally took it from. The king frowned down at me. You mean Minrir MacDougal of the clan MacDougals? The fiercest warrior in the lowlands and the wielder of the legendary blade Reasoned Response? The man you just defeated in single combat? That gentleman? I gulped. Clearly, this Minrir fellow was a renowned warrior, and definitely not somebody whose sword I needed to be mistreating. Yes, that's the fine, brave gentleman I was referring to. I'd, just like to give him his sword back. King and Cyrene traded an unreadable glance. Then the rapidly sobering ruler said, It shall be done. Minrir MacDougal of Clan MacDougal, approach the royal box, he bellowed. And a few minutes later, I saw the Lowlander shuffle forward, now helmetless and nursing a giant bruise where I had hit him. He was clean-shaven and had elaborate black and red tattoos on his face, and his black steel armor had similar patterns inscribed on it. It looked like it weighed as much as I did, and he seemed like the Grim Sword, pointedly did not look at me. "What's up, Chief?" he rumbled. "It's King Minrear, as you Lowlanders well know. The champion has requested that he be allowed to return your blade to you. I have agreed." Minrear turned to look at me, thoughtful look on his face. "Do you mean that? You do this of your own free will?" "Yes, yes, I do. I do it gladly. Honestly, I can't even lift the damn thing," I babbled as I presented Reed's response to him. "Please, take it. And, sorry about almost knocking your head in back there." He slowly reached out and effortlessly took the massive broadsword from me. "This is most unexpected, Matthias of the Minotaurs. Most unexpected. And no worries about the attempted braining, little man. It was well struck. And I appreciate the reminder that equipment maintenance should never be neglected." He effortlessly spun the blade once and returned it to the leather scabbard strapped across his back. "I accept your offering and will remember it." With a slight nod towards the king, he turned around and walked towards a large group of large and tattooed folk on the sidelines, clearly fellow Lowlanders. Looked up at the king and swallowed. He was now looking particularly grim and sober, and I noticed the royal bleeders had all quieted and were staring down at me with bright, beady eyes. "Okay, then. Next, I desperately looked around for inspiration, then happened to see the warrior I had appropriated the mace from, staggering to her feet. I hadn't noticed it at the time, what with the dust, bodies, and the weapons flying about, but she was wearing the distinctive green and gold colors of the Fry Maids of Aldercourt, a notorious company of female sellswords who had achieved infamy by first saving that city from a horde of disease-ridden nomadic goblins, and then turning around and sacking said city when the local burgermeisters had tried to stiff them on their feet. If anything, they were even more prickly than the Lowlanders, and I had not only stolen from one of them, but then I'd accidentally destroyed what I'd taken. This had all the makings of a bigger catastrophe than me dragging a reasoned response around like some sort of deadly, oversized children's toy. Then I had a burst of inspiration. "So, during the melee, I was forced to appropriate a weapon from a Fry maid, and then I totally accidentally splintered it on the head of that Lowlander. So I would like to give her the pick of any weapon in the royal armory to replace it. And then I'd also like to take this opportunity to express my greatest appreciation for her aid." I grinned hopefully up at the king, but the quiet gasp that went through the bootlickers, as well as his grim expression, told me I had just managed to somehow bork things up again. "Cerridus of the Fry Maidenhood, approach the royal presence," he bellowed. A few moments later, the scarred Fry maid sauntered up, rubbing her head. And she said, "How's it going, Chief?" smirking up at the now red-faced king. "It's King, damn it!" he shouted, "as both the Maidenhood and the entire city of Aldecor are treaty-bound to acknowledge. This champion," he gestured at me with contempt, "has apparently decided that you are to have free access to the royal armory to choose a weapon to replace the one that he broke on Minrear McDougal's head. So go do so. Don't take too long." He waved for one of the hangers-on to accompany her and grabbed another goblet from a nearby table, draining it in a single gulp. The Fry maid glanced over at me with a calculating look. "My little old mace helped you defeat the great Minrear McDougal, huh? There's a story there, I'm thinking." She winked at me. "Nothing much to tell," I said uncomfortably. "Just, a lucky shot is all. Dreadfully sorry I broke your weapon." "'Tis nothing, Caldorian," she said over her shoulder as she sauntered off. "I took it off a bad date last week, and honestly, it was a total piece of gaudy, top-heavy garbage. It looked nice enough, but I think it was made for show, not utility. I wouldn't have even used it, honestly, except I'm afraid I was drunk before we started. But I'm better now. Nothing like a good wallop on the skull to sober up. I'm sure I'll find something better in our good king's armory." I nodded at her, then turned back to the now silent crowd. Even the unwashed masses scattered around the tourney field had gone quiet, sensing that something was amiss between their king and his champion. "What's your last wish, champion? And be quick about it," he ground out. "We still have the jousts and the banquet to get through, so I don't have all day." "Right, right. What should I get next?" I tittered nervously, trying to think of something inoffensive, but not inoffensive enough to cause offense. And then I hit on it: a book. Now, I had long heard that the Royal Library had an extensive collection, which included the written works of most of the ill-found Empire philosopher kings, and even an extensive compendium of erotic goblin poetry. Now, the Royal Library wasn't open to the general public, however, which I always found somewhat annoying, but I suppose the High King didn't want their precious goblin erotica getting smudged by the unwashed masses' grimy fingers, or something along those lines. But it never made much sense, though, because what use is a book if it isn't read? I mean, it's not a painting that you can just stare at and pretend to gain insight from. A book requires effort, time, and thought to understand. And you can't do that if you can't even open the damn thing, now can you? But I digress. By all appearances, the king didn't seem like the type who did much reading at all, aside from goblin erotica, of course, but nobody admits to that. So I thought that he certainly wouldn't mind if I borrowed one of his books. I even had just the title in mind, something I'd heard about years ago during my studies of ancient history, and which I had been unable to find elsewhere. Now, I knew the Royal Library had it, as I had overheard several scholars discussing it over dinner a while back when I was forced to attend it several months ago. "In that case, I'll make this quick," I said confidently. "I'd like to borrow Lucius de Vartanian's Treatise on Nobility from the Royal Library, please." I smiled winningly up at him. Surely there was nothing wrong with this. It was only a book, after all. The courier crowd stilled, and the king looked at me with his face oddly blotchy, and his mouth worked soundlessly, as if he was some sort of fish that had recently realized it couldn't breathe air. Even Princess Diana's finally looked up from her cat and gazed down at me in confusion. "Daddy, did the dirty man just ask for a book? Why would he do that? Wouldn't he rather have a cat?" She lifted the large Tom from her lap and wriggled him at me. The cat gave me a long, suffering look and went limp. "I don't know, dear," the king said between gritted teeth, "but I certainly intend to find out." Cyrene looked at me thoughtfully for a moment and then leaned over to whisper in the king's ear. He looked at her with askance and then gave a stiff nod. "We'll deliver the book to your estate within the day," he said shortly. "You can keep it permanently." With that, his royal personage rose and stalked from the royal box, leaving his minions to flounder helplessly in his wake. Cyrene put the parchment she'd been reading into her satchel, gave me a small nod, and then followed. I stood still for a moment, confused about what had just happened. Now, I had clearly offended the king, not a wise thing to do in my inexpert opinion, but I had no idea why or how. Now, of course, my mistake was not realizing that there are very few things that weak leaders fear and hate more than ideas, particularly ideas in books, because they make people think. The more people think, the more likely they are to come to the realization that maybe this dear leader isn't everything he or she is cracked up to be. And, as I was soon to realize, our king was one of the weakest leaders in recent memory. "Huh, wonder what that was all about," I muttered. Then I shook myself. I looked around and noticed that Virulent Green had vanished at some point during my increasingly fraught conversation with the king, and even the unwashed masses seemed to have lost interest in the proceedings and wandered away, clearly disappointed that I wasn't going to be beheaded. In fact, the only creature that showed the slightest interest in me was Moose, and he shambled over after demolishing the last of the grass patch he'd found. He nudged me impatiently on the shoulder. "Yeah, I know. I'm ready to get out of here too," I said as I absently patted his scarred nose. "This has been a most unusual day." Mounting up, I slowly rode back to Calderhold, thinking on the fickleness of authoritarian rulers and how best to avoid being in close proximity to one ever again. And that's chapter 1. So I just want to, and when I'm reading through it, I have to stop myself. There's all these things I'm like, I should change that. I should change that. And you probably noticed my reading isn't entirely 100% like the writing is. But I mentioned why that is. It just seems to flow better when I extemporize. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I wrote or why I wrote this chapter. I was trying to introduce the main character, Matthias, and Moose, obviously, and come up with some way that they would kind of meet each other. And just doing the melee thing seemed like kind of a good way to do it. And then I also wanted to introduce Minrir. He comes back. And I did want to talk a little bit about the characters where I come up with. They're not based on people I know. I wouldn't go that far, but they are based on sort of ideas that I got from people that I know, if that makes sense. So Matthias was these most of them are coworkers. Matthias is somebody that I've worked with, or the idea of Matthias was somebody I worked with, just kind of vaguely in my head. In fact, he's not even. Now that I've said it, he's not even close. But again, I kind of had his vague idea of him in my head when I did it. And Minrer is a little more clear cut. He's somebody that he's like an acquaintance of mine. He was always just real quiet and huge. I always found him pretty wise. Still find him pretty wise. Just a good dude. And I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have that concept and kind of make him Minrer. And so that's where it came from. And then the Lowlander part, I was like, we all talk about Highlander clans, but I was like, yeah, Lowlander clans are kind of badasses too, right? So just went that route with it. And then some of the things I talked about in there, especially about books. I'm a librarian. I still can't, for the life of me, figure out why people want to torch these things or somehow, I actually don't understand why people collect books. I'll be honest. I mean, you need an archival copy for a library, which makes sense to me. But why would you need to have a book that is just pristine? I guess I can kind of understand it, but it seems like you're missing the whole point of a book, which is about the stuff that's inside of it, not the binding and the pages and all that. But all right, whatever you do, if you want to spend $50,000 on some rare book, be my guest. But yeah, if you're putting it in a private collection, God, that's annoying as hell, man. If you're going to buy these things, at least make it an archival copy that like a library can have so other people can see it. But yeah, anyway, that's always been kind of something that's stuck in my craw, as well as the whole thing about loud people not having a lot to say. That shit's, that's true regardless. Anytime you're in a crowd and there's a loud person in it, you can pretty much be assured that person is not only the weakest person in that whatever that social group is, but they also have the least to say. So just kind of a little thing I've noticed over the years. So anyway, that's kind of my thought process when I wrote this chapter. Like I said, it's the first thing I wrote. I would change a lot just going back through it, but I think it holds together fairly well. So next week, we will get back to chapter 2 and continue our adventure where Minrir makes another appearance, and we end up having to leave the main capital, trying to run away from assassins of all things. So you guys have a good day, and I'll see you next week.